Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm so delighted to be back. I'm still recovering from pneumonia, but each day I'm feeling better and better thanks to everyone who's asked me about it. I'm really excited about my guest today, who's from the great state of California, and she is a professor at the University of California, Davis. And her name, I love this name, is Tessa Hill. Hello, Tessa.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're so welcome. If I were ever to change my name, I would have it be Tessa Hill. It's such a nice, pretty, and easy name.
Well, it's funny, my mother's name is Sandy, so I
Oh,
personally really love the name Sandy. So,
that's
we have
funny.
we have mutual feelings about each other's names.
Well, that's good. Good. I love that. And speaking of names, it turns up that apparently, even though I've never met you, it turns up that you and I have a mutual acquaintance. I believe a work acquaintance, and her name is Kathleen Schaefer.
Hmm.
And she is, I believe, working on a PhD at the University of California, Davis.
That's right.
Now, how do you know Kathleen?
I don't know Kathleen well. I just know of her work, and it seems like she's doing excellent work thinking about floods and watersheds on a changing planet, and she works with great people at UC Davis. So, we run in overlapping circles. So that's fun that you were able to meet her.
I love it. And I'm working with Kathleen on a campaign that one day wants to make sure that every engineering student or every student working toward their engineering degree receives instruction on disasters. And she and I
Wonderful.
are very in agreement on this. And we actually met about a month ago.
Amazing. That's
Yeah.
great. So happy to hear that you're doing that work. That seems really important.
Oh yeah, I really look forward to being able to talk about that more at another time. But it just so turns up that I live in San Francisco part-time, and that's why this meeting was made possible. I love things when things like that happen. But anyway,
Yeah.
my producer makes me keep this podcast down to the standard length. Although I wish we could talk more about that. So I think we need to get underway. And how about I go ahead and introduce, excuse me, how about I go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about you before you get started?
That sounds great.
Okie doke. Tessa Hill is a professor in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department at the University of California, Davis, who teaches and researches oceanography and climate change. She is a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and she was awarded the Rachel Carson Lecture by the American Geophysical Union. Wow. Most people who have all these awards under their belt would be like 90 years old. And you don't look 90 at all.
Thank you. I think I've been lucky, and I work in a wonderful and supportive community that has supported me in many ways. So I think that's part of what you're hearing in that introduction.
Oh, and you're gracious as well.
Thank you, Sandy.
So, um, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the proverbial mic right over to you, and we're going to be talking. It's certainly in part about Tessa Hill's book, At Every Depth: Our Growing Knowledge of the Changing Oceans, which I have read and look forward to chatting a little bit more with our guest about. Anyway, take it away, Tessa.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show today. And I guess I'll say a little bit about my career path and my work, and then we'll segue quickly into the book. As you mentioned, I'm an oceanographer at University of California, Davis. I have the distinct pleasure of being based at a field laboratory on the Sonoma County coast called Bodega Marine Laboratory. And so I live and work in a really special place on the coast of Northern California. It's a beautiful place, and it's a place that's a mixture in terms of the marine lab is sort of a mixture of a lot of wonderful expertise about the ocean and how the ocean is changing and it's surrounded by and embedded within a fishing community of Bodega Bay, surrounded by a lot of agriculture, ranching and vineyards and other types of agriculture. And so it's a really interesting place to live because I get to think a lot about how people interact with the coast, what we do along the coast, why we care about the coast, how we rely on the coast as part of our work. And my research, as you mentioned, is focused on climate change impacts on the ocean. And so I've spent about 20 years at UC Davis thinking about how climate change has affected our own California coast, but also other places around the world. And I also, as part of my job, get to teach undergraduates and graduate students about the ocean and how the ocean is changing. And I think that is a really sort of natural pathway to start thinking about how we communicate those things. How do we talk to people about how we feel about the ocean, how we're connected to the ocean, and how also how that ocean is changing. And that led to the book, I think, because the book is ultimately about storytelling and connecting to people about the ocean through telling stories. And I think a big theme of the book is about partnerships and how partnerships between people can lead to positive solutions to challenges that we're facing about the ocean, whether that's about plastic pollution or climate change or how we sustainably fish and harvest from the ocean. The book is filled with stories of different types of people coming together, sharing their wisdom about the ocean, not just scientific wisdom, but all sorts of different types of wisdom, and thinking about ways to work together. And I will just, before I pause, and I'll just tell you one sort of anecdote here, which is that the book itself is an unlikely partnership because I have a co-author. My co-author is Eric Simmons, who is a journalist and author and magazine editor in the Bay Area. This is his third book. He's, written and thought a lot about how we describe how the environment is changing, how nature is changing, and how people are interacting with the environment. And he and I met, I think in like 2017 or 2018, because he was interviewing me for a story, actually. And so that's how we met. And we really hit it off, and we started having all of these follow-up conversations about how we tell the story of how the ocean is changing, and that people often look out at the ocean and they see a vast blue expanse, and they don't, it's hard to connect with how fast things are changing when what you see is like, a beautiful blue expanse in front of you and you don't see change. And just to sort of drive that home, I'll point out that, in California, we experience things like wildfires and droughts and floods. And so any person in my community can tell you how the environment around us that we live in has changed. People can tell you tons of stories about how the wildfire season has changed, or how what they can grow in their garden is different than it was 10 years ago, or about the floods that we're experiencing are so dramatic compared to their childhood. What if I told you those same changes, those same kinds of changes, that same, scale and scope of changes happening in the ocean, and we just don't immediately see or feel it? And so Eric and I really started thinking about this, and we formed an unlikely partnership. So a scientist and a journalist, and we made a decision to try to do something together to, create a vessel for other people's stories about what they are seeing and feeling in the ocean. So the goal of the book is ultimately to talk to some of the people who know the ocean best. So sometimes that's scientists, sometimes it's fishermen or folks who are engaged in aquaculture or farming along the coast. Sometimes it's indigenous communities. Sometimes it's just people who live along the coast. And we asked them to tell us, what do you see changing? And what are we losing in that change? And what are you doing to, address that or fight that change? And what can we all be doing as individuals? And so even the writing of the book itself, while a central theme of the book is partnering and building community and telling stories, the book itself is an example of that, because Eric and I worked for 6 years together to bring this project to where it is, and it was published last month in February. So so I'll pause there. I feel like I rambled a bit. I said a lot, and I definitely have other stories I can tell you about the book and how, what does it mean for a scientist and a journalist to come together to work on something like this. But yeah, let's see what you're interested in and what you think your readers are interested in.
Absolutely. Well, one of the first, it just popped into my head. Has any members of the fossil fuel world, industry, energy industry, you can call all kinds of things, oil and gas, fossil fuel, energy industry. The energy industry is probably the forces out there, the people out there who would most not want your information to become public knowledge, would not want everyone to have that. Have there been any negative reviews to your book by that industry?
Not by the industry directly, but I'll just say, I mean, the fossil fuel industry, is reliant on us needing their products. And so they do quite a few things to make sure that's always the case. One of those things that the fossil fuel industry, I mean, I don't have to tell you this, probably you and your listeners know this because there's so much evidence out there about this, but the fossil fuel industry has done a lot to put misinformation out there about climate change, about, a transition to renewable energies, and even about our use of plastics, because of course, plastic products, which does intersect with the themes of the book around plastic pollution, are also derived from fossil fuels. And so with all of that, our reliance on oil and gas as an energy source, but also our reliance on, millions and millions of single-use plastics all connects back to that same industry. And so that industry has a long history of putting misinformation out there.
Mhm.
And in my own research work, but also related to the book, I do get people, for example, with the book, there have been reviews posted about the book that, clearly reiterate these sort of climate change misinformation points. And
Mhm.
so, while that isn't the fossil fuel industry targeting me personally, they have, a very well-funded
Mhm.
army of people who are out there willing to put misinformation out into the public.
Yeah.
And the antidote to that,
Recognizing that is important.
yeah, yeah. So recognizing it, and the antidote to that misinformation is us actually talking to each other, making sure that we understand facts and truths about this work, but also building connections to people who want to work on this together. That's how we address misinformation and conspiracy theories about this, is actually by connecting to other humans and figuring out what people value, what they worry about, what they care about, and how we're going to work on those things together.
Wonderful. So on page 55, you mentioned something which is part of the challenge, and that is, as you mentioned, you look out, you see the bright blue sea, and it looks so big, and it looks so, how can it possibly change something so big? But the issue is we're only seeing the top of it, and as you pointed out on page 55, well, not you, but you actually quoted someone else. There's a low level of public awareness about, in this case, we were discussing seaweed forests, and compared to the ecosystems on land or the coral reefs in tropical latitudes, because these underwater forests are out of sight, out of mind.
That's right.
And their value and disappearance has largely gone unnoticed by the public. And so what your book does is when I was reading your book, I feel like I'm underwater and I'm looking at the kelp,
Mm-hmm.
the wind, and I'm looking at the seagrasses, which is pretty good because I'm actually claustrophobic, but reading the book, I'm actually really enjoying this experience. And so what you're doing is you're bringing us underwater
Mm.
and showing us what's going on down there. And I love the way you do it by always, it's difficult to find a place in the book, which has a lot of data packed into it. It's difficult to find a page where you're not discussing the people
Mhm.
involved in some way. Or if you haven't mentioned their name on that page, you're following the story of, let's say, Adam Dick, who that's his English name, but he grew up in Hawaii. I think his Hawaiian name was, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, Quaxistala.
Yeah, he's actually from sort of Pacific Northwest, Canadian coast, the Pacific
Oh,
coast of
okay.
Canada.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I got there's a lot of people in there. So I've got,
There are a lot of people, yeah. It's true. But I love that you noticed that well, first of all, I love that we brought you into the ocean because that certainly is a goal, is for us to transition that wide, vast blue landscape into something that we all really can relate to and feel absorbed in. That's certainly how I feel about the ocean. I would like to be sitting in a kelp forest as it's swaying in the waves. And so I appreciate that you picked that up, but also just the idea that people are so central to this is absolutely true. And there's a lot of stories in here. There's a lot of people in here. We actually worried that maybe there's too many people. So hopefully people can keep track of all those stories. But um, our use of the ocean, our connection to the ocean as people goes back very, very far. It goes all the way back to our evolutionary history as humans. We have always been very connected to the coast. And so it's really, you can think about it, it's in our DNA to feel a connection to the ocean. And we just have to find a way to re-find that sometimes, to reconnect with the ocean.
and I think you've done a really good job with the book. So speaking of Adam Dick, you're right, who was, of course you're right, about where he's from. It was more further north, and they were called First Nation people, which is a great name. It's very, very clear. But I was just so fascinated to read about how a lot of these First Nation individuals that had collected the knowledge, from their ancestors over, really thousands of years, that they're sharing information with scientists. Let me see if I can find the exact sentence here. I got the wrong page here, page 77. That that Mr. Adam Dick in later years saw some Western trained scientists and realizing that the indigenous science held answers to questions that their own research could not cover. And so the idea of them getting together, that is so cool. Uh,
Yeah.
I just loved hearing about that's actually going on. Um,
Yeah. Well,
and
one of my favorite stories in that,
right.
yeah, one of my favorite stories in that section is that those scientists end up getting a hold of Adam and his partner, his wife, and saying, well, we discovered this. We discovered that indigenous people have been gardening with clams for thousands of years and improving the way that we can harvest and raise clams for human consumption by doing so. And they literally say, we discovered this. And he says back, well, you didn't discover anything. That wasn't something that was lost and needed to be found, because we've always known that was the case. And it's so powerful to think about Western science having this realization that indigenous science has held this knowledge for thousands of years, and Westerners are just now sort of coming to that.
Just now coming around. And also, by the way, the Tessa and the co-author Eric Simmons have, in addition to talking about the people, you're also learning about the people. We've all heard a little bit about the Canadian attempts to to erase indigenous knowledge. And so it's really interesting reading about the extraordinary lengths that they went through to protect this one young 4-year-old boy for the rest of his life. It's really, really interesting stories. We don't have time to get into now, but I learned that this is not a book that you're going to read in 2 days. This is a book you're going to take time to read. It's got so much in there, and I want to remember every single thing I read. There was one other thing you touched on, and I remember reading about that, the clam gardens and the fish ponds. There, it is possible to improve, to make a change. This is very encouraging to hear. You can make changes that benefit both the people and nature. That it
Yes.
can be done. It's just that
Yes.
you need to do it. The First Nation people and people that have been doing this for 1,000 years do it, but they didn't just wake up one day and said, "Let's do this tonight." It evolved into what not what science isn't the right word, but it evolved into what would be a good word to describe the clam ponds, the fish ponds and the clam fields.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I actually would say it is, I mean, I think it is indigenous science. And I think calling it that is giving it an appropriate amount of respect for the knowledge that these indigenous scientists and knowledge holders have had for thousands of years. So I think it's fine to call it science. I think it's good to call it science. I
Okay.
also think you can say, one of the big themes of that chapter is that if you're, I'll just acknowledge my own positionality here. I'm a white woman who was raised in the United States. And from that point of view, what I learned in school about indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest was that it was so abundant. There were resources everywhere. And so it was, quote unquote, easy for indigenous tribes to live in that environment. And what we now understand, and what I hope readers see that was a very intentional reframing in the chapter, is that yes, it is an abundant place. It's a place of intense beauty and biodiversity and of marine life. But indigenous people have been managing and stewarding the land and the sea for thousands of years. It was not through sheer abundance. It was not easy. It was not through luck. It was through knowledge. And that is a different way of framing how people lived than what I was taught in school. And I think it's really important. And I also just want to return to something that you said, which is also a frame shift that I hope people see. I think Western scientists like myself have often been trained to think about people and nature as two different things, that they are separate things. And you just said, we can do things that improve things for people and nature. And part of that framing is that people are part of nature. We are part of nature. We are part of this system that we live in.
Mhm.
And thinking about how we sustainably harvest and manage food from the ocean requires us to acknowledge our own place in that system, that we are not separate of it. And I think that's another theme of the book that you sort of immediately pulled out, which is great.
And I thank you. And I was very encouraged. I mean, I felt better.
Mm.
It's easy to feel, huh, what are we going to do? And how can I help? But reading about this was very encouraging to me, and I felt better. And of course wanted to learn more about it. What else is going on down here around the world, and I'm sure there's lots of places where the things are being done that benefit both, the coral and the seals, and also benefiting humans because we have food to eat and shelter. So
Mhm.
that was very, very encouraging, and I really am grateful to be reading about this. Um, so yeah, this is a great book. I'm not quite finished. I didn't give myself quite enough time. What I should have done is interview you in 2 months from now, but I was just so excited.
Yeah,
Not that it
I
takes 2 months to read the book, but not that I meant like that, but I didn't have quite enough time to get the whole book read, but I'm off to a great start and look forward to finishing it.
It's great. I do think, we were thinking about multiple different people who might read this book when we read it. And we certainly were thinking about scientifically interested members of the public. So, we wanted it to feel very open to anyone who was interested to pick up the book and read it. We also want college professors to feel like they could use it in a classroom that's about climate change, or how the ocean is changing, or how the world is changing, or how people are working together to address those changes. And so part of what you're noticing is that it's sort of scientifically rich and data dense because we wanted it to translate into that classroom setting too. So hopefully, your listeners will bear with us as they read, that it really is meant for everyone to be able to read, but it's also, chock full of resources and citations, and sort of, it has a depth to it that a classroom teacher could use, because a classroom teacher could take the book and say, okay, we're going to read this chapter, and then we're going to read 3 of the resources that they cite, and we're going to go a layer deeper. And that was our intent.
I will say that every single chapter, if you wanted to know more, Tessa and Eric provided, footnotes if you wanted to know more. But if you just wanted to be like a layman, which I am, and learn about this, you could do that as well. So it's really, you've done a good job of making it accessible pretty much to all. I think. Good job.
Thank you. We tried. We worked hard at that.
And it's hard. And it took me, by the way, 5 years to write my book as well. So I understand. I understand.
Yeah.
So we're about run out of time though, but we do have time if there's anything else you'd like to add for our listeners.
I guess the thing I'll add is that I hope that you start the book and you make it all the way to the end, because the ending is really important. You mentioned this, that the book, attempts to strike this balance of talking about the challenges that we face, but also feeling hopeful. And I think that the very end of the book is worth getting to, because it is a story of hope about people coming together and addressing a challenge and actually seeing things move in a positive direction. And we thought a lot about how we want to end the book. So I hope, even if it feels like you're learning a lot somewhere in the middle of the book and you're like, wow, this is taking me a little while, I encourage you to, stick with it and get to the story at the end, because the end really attempts to strike exactly that balance that you were just talking about hope and challenge and partnerships and togetherness, all wrapped into one.
How about you say that last line? She's usually very quiet. How about you say that last line one more time?
Sure.
What, 1 second. Sazzy, go lay down. Go lay down. Sazzy, go lay down. Go lay down. Good girl. Go lay down. Good girl. She had to get that last woof in. Okay, so I hope you remember where you were.
Yeah, so I hope you can get all the way to the end of the book, because the book really strikes that balance. The last part of the book really strikes that balance of hope and challenge and partnerships and togetherness, that sort of the whole book is attempting to tell the story of. The final story is really important in that.
Well, you have my solemn promise. I'm going to finish it. I want to know what happened to a lot of these people,
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Tessa Hill, for your for this interview today, and thank you, the listeners, for joining us today. Please like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys.
Thank you.
Sure. Tessa, stay with me. I forgot to tell you to hang on while I stop recording.